he's kind of trendy and fashionable these days. Actually, it's it's one of the fastest growing religions in the U.S. or in the West in general. And a lot of it is because of the interest in meditation and contemplative practices more generally. And so a lot of people come to Buddhism who may not be particularly interested in the religion, but are interested in some of the practices, which is fine because, every religion has an element of practice and an element of faith. And so if you ask a typical Christian minister, for example, if you said, I don't know anything about Christianity, what is it? He would probably say, God so loved the world that he gave his only son, which is a statement of belief, right? Statement of faith. This is what we believe in. Whereas with Buddhism, it's much more a path of practice. So the Buddha was a human being. This is actually a little bit more complicated than that, but generally speaking, Buddhism was founded by a human being named Gautama, who was born in India about 2,600 years ago, and decided that, and he was very wealthy. He was a person of privilege and wealth, and his father, wanted to give him everything he could, and so the Buddha had a pretty luxurious lifestyle, and so but he recognized that despite his wealth and despite his privilege, that he was going to experience birth and death and illness and old age and all of these unpleasant things, and that there was no way around that. And then he found that there were people who were living a spiritual life, a holy life, trying to find a way out of the cycle of coming and going. So, in India back then and even now, it's kind of generally accepted that there's rebirth. Buddhism talks about rebirth and reincarnation a little bit differently. We talk about rebirth. I don't go into all of the semantic differences there, but basically, India in 500 years, 600 years BC was not a pleasant place. Being born meant you were going to experience some very, very difficult things. And so he found that there were people who were trying to get out of that cycle. And so he decided that he would go and see if he could figure out how to do that. And at the time, there were a number of ascetics, again, still are. If you ever visit India, you'll find people who are living very ascetic lifestyles. And the idea was that if you deprived yourself enough, put yourself through enough difficulty, that you might stop creating negative karma that would bring you back. And so you transcend the cycle of coming and going by basically starving yourself, standing on one leg, staring at the sun, things like that. And so the Buddha was doing these things. And I'm referring to him as the Buddha because we're talking about him as, from this perspective, at the time he was not the Buddha. He was Gautama. He was an ascetic. So he really found some very good teachers, learned what they had to teach about meditation, wasn't enlightened, found some ascetic teachers, started studying, practicing asceticism, almost starved himself to death, realized this isn't going to get me where I want to go. And so he began to take meals again, got his strength back, sat down beneath a tree, determined to sit there and meditate until he was awakened. And after a week, approximately, he was enlightened. And so what he was enlightened to was a path out of suffering. And so if you read the academic explanation of Buddhism, there's always the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. So the first truth is just, if you're born, you're going to experience difficulties. A lot of the time, the textbooks will say all life is suffering, Well, that's not really what the Buddha said. If you're born, you're going to experience some difficulties. And the stresses and so on of life have a cause. That's the second truth. The third truth is that if there's a cause, there's a remedy. And the fourth truth is that the remedy is this path of practice, which is an eightfold path, but I'm gonna make it a little easier to remember. It's basically seeing things as they are and resolving to live in a way that will get you out of the cycle of suffering. So that's developing wisdom and discernment. And then living in a way that is non-harmful and is compassionate toward yourself and all other beings. And then training the mind so that you learn to let go of patterns of thinking that lead to difficulty, cultivate patterns of thinking that lead to happiness. And basically that is the path of practice. And he said, if you do these things, then you'll get out of the cycle of coming and going. So, the Buddha was trying to find a way out of, birth and rebirth. But the method of practice, which is, sums up in, do good, avoid evil, train your mind, don't do the things that lead to stress, do the things that lead to happiness. That works even if you're trying to transcend the normal day-to-day stress of living in a crazy world where there's a global pandemic, or just, having a job that is not any fun, and all of those things. You could sum up the training with the realization that the difficulties that we experience, the suffering we experience, is primarily the result of the way the mind engages with reality. Circumstances are essentially neutral, but what we do with the mind, how we respond to what comes into our awareness, determines what our experience of life is going to be like. So a lot of people, find out a little, read a little bit about Buddhism, and they see some of those things and they go, well, that makes a lot of sense. Let me see if I can learn how to do this practice. And it's totally okay with us if you're a Christian or Jewish or Baha'i or whatever, and you want to practice Buddhism. We're completely okay with that. And so you get a lot of people who are, sort of in this dual faith position, Christians who practice Buddha, who consider themselves also Buddhist, Jewish Buddhists, and so on. And so there's a couple of books that really explore the intersection of Christianity and Buddhism, for example. So let me take a breath. Where would you like me to go from here? I mean, that's kind of sums up what
I feel like that was a great explanation of just kind of like the basic teachings of Buddhism, because I think it really helps like set the foundation,
set the scene.
And actually that was extremely helpful for me, and I am like really interested in, and maybe we can get into it later, but that kind of intersection between Buddhism and other faiths, because I do know personally a few Christian Buddhists and Jewish Buddhists, but I think just to kind of get started, I'd love to go back to maybe the beginning of your journey, what faith looks like for you in your childhood, and then ultimately how you came to learn about Buddhism and became a Buddhist.
Okay, sure. So I'm 64 years old, and when I was a kid, I got really interested in music, and my original career plan was that I was going to be the fifth Beatle, which didn't work out. But since I was going to do this, when the Beatles went to India to study meditation, and so did a lot of other relatively well-known people. And so I thought, well, I should learn something about this meditation stuff. And so I was looking into that. I was raised Baptist, so I'm going to tell this story. I'm not disparaging Baptists. Some of my best friends are Baptists, okay? And probably if this had happened at a different time and in a different place, I might have ended up going in a different direction. But the church that I grew up in was pretty conservative. And I was living at a time, I was coming of age at a time when the civil rights movement was very much in full swing, and when there was a war in Vietnam. And the anti-war movement was gaining some steam when I was about 11, 12, 13 years old. And so I thought war was a bad thing, and I thought equal rights was a good thing. And it appeared to me that the religion that I belonged to, that my ancestors belonged to, thought completely differently. They seemed to like war and not like equal rights. And so there was a moment when I think I was about 13 years old, and was visiting my grandparents. My grandfather was a deacon at the Baptist church in this little town in Texas where they lived. And they started talking about how a Black family had shown up at their church, and how my grandfather and the other deacons had gone over and told them where the Black church was, and that they would be more comfortable there. And I said I didn't think that sounded very Christian. And so I was told to leave the table. So on our way back home after that, I told my parents I wasn't going to church anymore. I didn't feel right in that setting. But I didn't lose my interest in religion in general. I didn't feel like I had fallen away from God. I just felt like I'd fallen away from the religion of, that particular side of religion. And so I became kind of a seeker. And so I was trying to learn to meditate, I lived in Lubbock, Texas, and there was pretty much the opportunities to learn meditation for a white teenage kid in Lubbock, Texas were few and far between. But I did what I could do to study what I could. And whenever I read anything about Buddhism, it seemed to really make sense. So in the 70s, there were a number of books coming out about Zen. And I was reading a lot of them, and I started kind of thinking of myself as a Zen Buddhist, although there was nothing official I could do about that. We moved to Florida, and again, when it came to opportunities to practice Buddhism for me, there weren't any. But I always continued to read and try to practice. And in the late 80s, there was a Unitarian minister in Orlando who had studied with a Vietnamese Zen master named Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, who's probably the second best known Buddhist in the world, and she next to the Dalai Lama. And she had gone to some retreats with him, and so she started a meditation group. And they were reading his books and practicing his style. And so I was going to those meetings. So that was the first formal training, first sitting in a group I ever got. And again, I kind of identified as Buddhist, but there was nothing official about that. Even, I mean, she wasn't an ordained Buddhist monk or anything like that. But at least I felt like I was part of a spiritual community at that point. So a little after 2000, my wife and I moved to where we are now in DeLand, Florida. And there was a group that started a guy had read some books by Thich Nhat Hanh, and the woman had gone to some retreats with this guy named Lama Surya Das, who's a Jewish kid from New Jersey, I think, who became a Tibetan monk. And so they wanted to start a group and see who was around who would come in and practice Buddhism with them. And so my wife went to the first couple of meetings, and she started encouraging me to come. So I was a freelance journalist for a long time. So I think I was covering commission meetings the first couple of meetings. And so I went with her to their third meeting. And I remember leaving, getting in the car and go home and saying, "Honey, whatever you do, don't let me end up in charge of this." And so a year later, I was in charge of it. The people who started the group didn't want to continue running it. So they kind of gave me the keys to the church. They were meeting at a Unitarian church and put me in charge. So at that point, I thought, well, I need to get some formal instruction, because people were showing up and expecting someone to tell them what to do. And so we started going to a Thai temple down by Disney World, and going to retreats and getting real formal studies there from the abbot, who is still one of my best friends in the world. And so I ordained as a Thai monk first. In Thai Buddhism, if you're ordained, you live at the monastery, and that's that. You know, shave your head. I had a ponytail halfway down my back. I shaved my head, took the robes, but they'll do temporary ordinations. So my wife agreed to let me ordain for a little while. So I ordained for a little while, as long as I figured I could take off from work and still have a house and car when I got back. And then, but after that, I felt like I really needed something tangible to be able to offer people who were coming to our community looking for guidance and leadership. And also, I had been asked to volunteer at the chapel at a local state correctional institution. There were a group of incarcerated individuals there who wanted to practice Buddhism, and they weren't allowed to meet together if they didn't have a volunteer. So I had started going there as a volunteer and just sitting with this group. And there are things that ordained people can do. You know, we can have confidential conversations and that sort of thing. And, you know, if somebody wants to formally become a Buddhist, there's a ceremony that you can do for that and that sort of stuff. And so I started looking at Buddhist chaplaincy programs, and I found a program that I could do remotely for the most part. It's based in California, but it grew out of the Buddhist Temple of Chicago, which was founded in the 1940s after World War II. And it was based in Japanese Buddhism, but was non-sectarian, deliberately non-sectarian. And so I did this 2-year seminary program, you could call it, and got the title Sensei as a result of that. Sensei means teacher, so that's my official religious title, is Sensei. And that allowed me to do some of these things, weddings and funerals and refuge ceremonies. When you become a Buddhist, you do a thing called going for refuge. But I still felt like a Zen Buddhist. And I had developed a fairly close relationship with the Zen community, but also had developed a friendship with the abbot of a Vietnamese monastery about an hour from where I live. And so I was going to this Vietnamese monastery, White Sands Buddhist Center, as a guest for a while. And then the abbot there decided that he would give me Dharma transmission. He felt like I was a good teacher. And so there's this thing called Dharma transmission, which is when one Zen master recognizes another Zen master, basically. And there's this sort of wordless transmission of the teachings. And so he did that for me. So I became a Zen master of the Rinzai Zen lineage, and then ordained as a Soto Zen monk, which doesn't mean anything to anybody, but you know, it's just kind of the path I took. One of the reasons that I ordained in Soto Zen is that I wouldn't have to leave my wife, which was kind of important. But also, the founder of Soto Zen is a guy named Ehi Dogen, who was amazingly egalitarian with regards to things like women's roles in the ministry and that sort of thing. And we're talking about 13th century Japan. And he was saying, you know, no difference between men and women and that kind of stuff. So there were a lot of things about him that I really liked. So I became a Zen monk. And around the same time, there was a chaplain at Stetson University who had been there for a decade or so, and he was sick. He was in hospice, and the hospice people asked him if he'd like to see a chaplain, and he said no, because I know everything every chaplain ever says, and I don't want to hear the cliches that I've said over and over again to other people. And he said, but if you can get Sensei Morris to come visit me, I would like that. I'd met him at a couple of events at the university. And so I started going, I went over and said, what do you want? And he wanted me to do his end of life guidance. And so he became a Buddhist Baptist and before he passed away. And that got me on the school's radar. So when they just were trying to decide what to do to replace him, they invited me to be they replaced him with 3 chaplains, and I was one of the 3. So I'm in this very interfaith, multi-faith kind of environment now, which is, I'm very comfortable with, but it's interesting challenges.
It's a really powerful journey, I think. Just kind of
Thanks.
Sounds like you navigated so many different types of belief, but also, especially I think in the Western world, learning like true Eastern belief, not just the practice, like you mentioned earlier, is quite an accomplishment. That was really great to hear.
Okay.
I'm kind of curious about, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please ask your question.
I was kind of curious about, because you talked about the end of life, helping them through this end of life journey. And also earlier in the conversation, you talked about there's, or at least from what I know, there's a difference in beliefs of reincarnation between Buddhists and Hindus. I'm kind of curious in Buddhism, what the teachings are about kind of the end of life and the cycle and the kind of what the cycle of life is like.
Okay. So I'm going to talk from a bunch of different perspectives here, all right? Because, I came to Buddhism pretty much as a humanist, and a lot of Americans who come to practice Buddhism are pretty humanistic. As my practice matured, I'm still humanistic in terms of how I practice, but I do see it as something that transcends this particular lifetime. So the classical view, so the difference between like reincarnation as described in, for lack of a better term, Hinduism, and rebirth as described in Buddhism, is that in a sort of classical Indian view, there was a soul that was kind of a discrete thing that contained sort of the essence of me, and that soul would transmigrate from form to form. And so one of the descriptions of it in that particular literature is that of the image of a caterpillar crawling from plant to plant. Same caterpillar, different plants. Same soul, different bodies. The Buddha said he had tried to find this self that was resident somehow in here, and that he didn't find it. And he said, what we identify as self is really form, all the physical stuff, the air and the fire and the water and all that kind of stuff. And mind, feelings, perceptions, thoughts, and awareness. And that those aggregates that what I identify with as me is an aggregate of these aggregates. And so when the karma that brought this into existence, this particular form into existence, runs out, then those aggregates fall apart. But the actions in this lifetime kind of cling onto to the consciousness, and so the clinging wants to take form. It wants to cling to stuff and take form. And so the nature of the clinging that is resident, that you built up over your life, when you pass away, will create another form. And so what form your next life is the function of what you did in this life. So the metaphor is a lot more like a candle flame. If you lit a candle and let it almost burn away, and then the heat, as that first flame became almost extinguished, you lit another candle from it, then you'd have another flame. It's not the same flame. The flame doesn't jump from one candle to another, but the energy in that flame is one of the causes for the next flame. Does that make sense? So that's kind of the difference. So in sort of the pre-Buddhist view of karma was almost like predestination. There was actually multiple views in India. There was one that what you did in this life didn't affect anything, so you might as well have a good time because, when it ended, that was it. It was all over. And then another view was that what you did in this life affected the next life and predetermined it. And so whatever happens to you in this life is the result of what was predetermined in the previous life. And the Buddha said, nah, you know what, I think that past karma, present karma, and future karma are what's important. So you come into this moment based on what's happened in the past. You're creating karma in this moment that's going to affect your future. And the actions that you do in the future are going to determine, along with all of the stuff that you've already brought along with you, is going to determine your next form. So again, if you're a humanistic and don't particularly want to believe in rebirth, you don't have to, because what you do in this moment is going to affect your tomorrow, right? If you do good things, avoid doing bad things, and train your mind, you're going to like life better in the future than you do, than if you don't. That if you, do bad things and avoid good things, and all that kind of stuff. So the cycle is the same either way. So I said, so the Buddha himself he taught in a fairly humanistic way. So there are multiple sort of canons in Buddhism. The canonical text of Christianity is the Bible. The canonical text of Buddhism is about 15 feet of bookshelf space, and that's just the original canon. After the Buddha died, Buddhism didn't just kind of become static and stay there. It encountered other cultures and stuff. So there are sort of more advanced, progressed, evolved versions of Buddhism, however you want to look at that say, okay, that when you become fully enlightened, you don't just leave, you can actually become a Buddha. And the Buddha himself is eternal. And so at that point, then Buddhism starts to look pretty theistic. The original teachings were not particularly theistic. They were pretty humanistic. But if you look at the way most Asians practice and things like that, then you get kind of grasp this, you encounter this eternality of the Buddha that looks a lot like God. It's a little different, though, in that what we're talking about is really oneness. Everything sort of arises as a function within sort of the greater whole. So where you start finding a lot of commonality with like Christian theology there is if you read something like Thomas Merton, where he talks about God as the ground of being. So when you take Buddhism to that cultural level, which is, sometime after the Buddha passed away, then you start to encounter things that look very much like that. So did that help?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
and that's one thing that like I'm really interested in is the the crossover and what aspects of like Buddhist teachings can go very well and pair very well with whether it be Christian doctrine, especially within like Judaism and Christianity, and looking more at like I'd be interested to know kind of your experience and thoughts, just like being more in the interfaith space and where you see how Buddhism and more Western religion can have a lot of ties.
So there's a couple of levels, and one is when you start to look at ways that contemplative practice can enhance or contribute to your faith practice, right? Then I'll tell you a story. There was a priest. I think this was Father Robert Kennedy, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I'm telling the right story about the right priest. But at any rate, there was a period of time when the Catholic Church was kind of exploring ecumen. There was an ecumenical movement. They're kind of looking for a lot of common ground. And so there was this priest who went to a Zen retreat, several-day retreat, with a number of other priests and other people and so on. And so he was, the way these are structured, you spend a lot of time sitting in meditation. You do a little bit of group chanting in the morning. There's sort of a religious service at the beginning of the day. You do some mindful work and, things like that. But a part of the process is that you get to have a one-on-one conversation with the teacher who's leading the retreat. And so there was a fairly famous Japanese guy who was leading this particular retreat. And this priest came in on his first day to meet with this Roshi, and he said, I'm a Jesuit priest, and the Roshi means teacher, Zen master. And the Roshi says, oh, okay. And so they talk a little bit, and the Roshi says, okay, well, let me give you a koan. So a koan is kind of a story that doesn't quite make sense logically, but it's really designed to kind of get you to stop thinking and analyzing and just kind of experience with your heart. So he said, what were Jesus's last words? And the priest said, Father, why have you forsaken me? And the Roshi says, no, and rings the bell, which is the signal for him to get up and leave. So he gets up and leaves. And he goes back and he's meditating and he's thinking, I'm pretty sure that's right. And so that night, he looks it up and he's like, yeah, Father, why have you forsaken me? And so the next day he gets his one-on-one with the Roshi, and Roshi goes, well, did you think about it? And he says, yeah. He said, I even looked it up. It's Father, why have you forsaken me? And the Roshi goes, no, rings his bell. He leaves. And so this goes on for the whole, I don't know how many days the retreat was. It was probably a 5-day retreat. That's pretty typical. And so on the last day, he comes in to have his one-on-one with the Roshi, and the Roshi goes, well, what do you think? Do you have anything else to say? And he goes, no. He says, I know that's what he said. What is it you're looking for from me? And this little Japanese guy leans back and throws his arms open and yells to the heavens, which I'm not going to do because I don't want to blow out everybody's radios when you're listening to this. Father, why have you forsaken me? And he says this with all his power and emotion and tears streaming down his eyes. And the priest gets, he wanted me to know what that was, to feel that for myself, to experience that's the depth of this sacrifice and to make this connection there. And so he walked out going, this little Japanese guy was trying to make me a better Christian, which by having me experience what it means, not just to be a Christian, but to live that. And so, that's one way that you can bring Buddhism and the practice of Buddhism to experiencing, what it means to practice your faith, whatever your faith is. And there's I mentioned Thich Nhat Hanh. He's written a couple of books. One of them is called Living Buddha, Living Christ. One of them is called Going Home, Jesus and Buddha as Brothers. He actually got to know Thomas Merton, and so he, really got his view of Christianity, and so he kind of considered himself to be both at some point. And then Father Robert Kennedy has written a book called Zen Gifts for Christians, and there's some others out there. There's a book that I can't think of the name of. It's about how to be Jewish and Buddhist, and so there's a lot of books out there now on that kind of thing. But like I said, we're total. If you walk into one of my meetings, I have absolutely zero desire to convert you. I want to help you find your path, and that's really kind of what we do, is help people find their path. So, to explore that, I would say just start practicing.
Yeah, I really like that. That's one thing I noticed that always, especially from my background of having a very consequential faith of do it right, or, it's, everything is lost. It's it's cool to see that in Buddhism, at least from what I've seen of the, well, this is what we think would really help you out, and like this is what would be best for you. But if you go to a different path, like we're not gonna tell you not to do that. I don't know. It's a very comforting way of thought, it seems.
Yeah, well, being realistic, I mean, you'll find people who'll say, "Oh, this is the way we do that, and this is the right way," because Buddhists are human beings too. So, you're going to meet people who are really attached to their practice. But it's kind of built into Buddhism to not attach to anything, including your practice. So, it's maybe less common than some other religions might be. The other thing I'll say though is that I find as I talk to people from other faiths that, first of all, the major religions are major religions because they contain a lot of wisdom and compassion and kindness and those kinds of things. And so there's always at least that much common ground. But the other thing is, when you find people who are really grounded in their faith, they've really used their faith to get to a deeper, more spiritual relationship with the world. You're talking, it doesn't matter what faith they are, you're talking to the same people. It's really hard to put this into words, but I have friends who are Sikh, I have friends who are Catholic, I have friends, and once we're talking as people of faith, we're talking the same language, even though we come from different traditions. I can't think of the guy's name. There's a theology guy out there who's identified, I think, 6 stages of faith, and the highest stage of faith, basically you've transcended your faith, and so you're having the same conversation with everybody regardless. So and I think that's when you put that kind of effort, the way you were describing, sort of do it right, and do it right in a way where you're really connecting to the greater purpose and meaning and the greater reality of life, then when you get to that level, Zen master, Catholic priest, whatever, it's all the same thing.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think that's one thing we've even seen just like on our podcast, talking with people, is like the more you kind of dive into these different faith practices and just like talking about spirituality, I think you really start to realize that we're all more similar than we are different. And it's like every faith is kind of trying to get people to like the same destination in a lot of ways, especially when it comes to like mindset and how we just interact with the physical world. I'm interested, for your journey and kind of just, being able to experience all these different people and faith practices, what, I guess, like on a personal level, like what has Buddhism, brought to you? Like, as far as just like, I know that's a really loaded question, but, just like, what has it meant for you personally, and how has it benefited your life?
So, I'm a human being. Human beings come into this life carrying baggage from, whether you want to look at it as previous lives or hardwired, genetic tendencies or whatever. I mean, I had alcohol issues. I had, drugs were a big deal when I was in high school, and so I got into that. But then I decided I liked drinking better, and and it took me to places that were not places you want to go. And so Buddhism, I mentioned the Unitarian minister who had been on the retreat, as I had quit drinking and was trying to kind of figure out where to go from there. That was about the time that she started that group. And so it gave me not just community, but it gave me a sense of practice, direction. I was not a good candidate for AA because of my general humanistic slant. But Buddhism was, fit in okay with that. the I would say if it weren't for Buddhism, I probably wouldn't be here, really. I mean, honestly, we're, like I said, we come into this life carrying the baggage, and then we're born in a certain place, at a certain time, to certain parents. And my father was a very violent alcoholic and stuff like that. So having a practice, having Buddhism as a refuge has really helped me to resolve a lot of things that happened in my childhood and so on, that I don't know what I would have done otherwise with that stuff. I probably wouldn't have lived, because the alternative for me was sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? So I still play a little rock and roll, but it's in a different context than it would have been back then. I'd have probably been one of those dead at 27 guys, really. But today, it has been a long journey, and I'm just happier. I noticed one day, and this was probably 10 years ago or so, I was standing in line at the supermarket waiting for, I was going to get subs for my wife and I. And the guy making sandwiches, there was only one guy making sandwiches, and he was very slow. And I was kind of looking around, and everybody else was just so annoyed, and they were kind of shuffling their feet, and they were doing all this things all the time. And it was just, the tension was just almost tangible. You could almost feel it. And I was pretty happy being where I was. And I realized, that there was a time when I was very much a type A person, and I would have been probably the worst one in line there. But because of my practice, I was able to be pretty comfortable just being in the present moment, whatever was going on in the present moment. It was no big deal. I was leaving the prison one day, and the people in the control room were in no hurry to let me out, and it occurred to me that it would do me absolutely no good to get irritated, right? Because the more irritated I got, the less concerned they would have been, right, about my mood. And I thought, it's really nice to have this patience, and be able to recognize that, and to not be freaked out about all the other things I have to do and how unfairly I'm being treated and all that kind of junk. I would have just been making myself miserable. So, I wish I had developed that degree of patience when I was younger, but that's the way life is sometimes.
Yeah, and I feel like that's also such a commonality with a lot of faiths, is kind of that like redemptive quality that like faith can bring you. And not to go totally like on a different tangent, but you've brought up a few times about working with people who are incarcerated. And I had a little bit of an experience with that, just like more in a Christian context, but I am interested, from your perspective and experience, for people who are, have done bad things, and we've all done bad things, or just, at very difficult times and dark times in their life, as being kind of a leader and a teacher. How have you seen Buddhism really help people who are incarcerated or struggling with addiction and things like that?
Well, first, I will say that the statistics show that any religious program, any faith, reduces the risk of recidivism, or reduces the recidivism rate. So, and I think that there are things about religion in general, religious programs in general. There's a community, there's people who accept you as you are. That's the kind of the one thing I find a lot of by talking to inmates, is that they never really felt accepted by anybody. And by the way, I use that term out of habit, but because they use it in the prison system. But I try to say incarcerated people. We don't categorize them that way. But anyway, I find that most of the ones who come to our meetings come in saying, so I'm this in a dorm with this guy over here who seems to be so laid back all the time, and he seems to be very comfortable and pretty happy and, you know, easygoing and all of that. And I want to know what his secret is. And he said he's a Buddhist. So here I am. You know, it makes it possible for them to, I think it makes them better people, generally better behaved people. They're not perfect. Certainly they end up with one in confinement now and then and that sort of thing. But generally, I think they act out a little bit less. And so they create less stress for themselves. And it makes it easier for them to accept these really unpleasant circumstances that they're in. You know, and it's the most rewarding thing I do, really. I mean, you know, we talk about suffering, and most of the time we're talking about, you know, when we're talking to the average American, that's kind of an abstract idea, really. But when you're talking to people who are literally not free, physically free, and who can have everything taken away from them in a heartbeat, and, you know, it really makes this idea of suffering a lot more tangible. It makes it, I think, your practice a lot more urgent in a way. You know, you really take it more seriously, I think, when you see what suffering can really look like.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, I feel like those are the people that could use it the most too, that could really use a hope and a way to gain control over their lives and themselves. I think this has been a really powerful conversation. I really hate to start wrapping it up because I mean, I've truly enjoyed this a lot, but I'm just curious to start wrapping it up. What would be a big takeaway for our listeners? What would be the one takeaway, if you could, for listeners that you'd want them to hold on to?
Well, you know, do good, avoid evil, train your mind. You have a lot of opportunities to do that these days. The upside of living in a global pandemic is that there's an awful lot of online activity right now. So if you want to explore Buddhism, it's probably easier now than it's ever been. And, you know, you don't have to renounce the faith that you've been practicing in order to incorporate some of these principles, you know. So just do it. You don't have to know a lot. Just start. You know, and start where you are. You are who you are. You don't have to change in order to practice a spiritual path of any kind. And you know, times of great difficulty are the times that motivate us to move toward freedom. And, you know, so this is a good time to do that.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that with us. It was great to talk to you, Morris.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Great. Have a good one.